plan to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer.
The initial rally, planned by a group with ties to white supremacists.
A massive car bomb exploded outside of a large federal building in downtown Oklahoma City.
Looking at the right today, you're probably noticing it's getting maybe more militarized. Certainly appears that they are. Many words of far-right extremist groups have become household names. Boogaloo Boys, Three Percenters, militia people. And it seems that there's no protest that can happen without somebody showing up with a weapon of war. But this movement has roots. This group in general is called the White Power Movement. And it's a sort of congealment or strategic alliance between different right-leaning groups ranging all the way from neo-Nazis and Klan members to paramilitarists and, doomsday preppers. And it began as an anti-communist movement born in the jungles of Vietnam. And that's what we're going to talk about today. There's a powerful myth in the story of the Vietnam War that the government betrayed its people, that betrayed the troops, and that if they had just stayed the course, they would have been able to win against communism, and that the world would be a different place. And that when these people came home, they were disrespected by, malcontents at home who were too busy trying to push for civil rights and women's rights to care about the true fight, which is preserving capitalism or whatever. More often to these people, white supremacy, which is kind of intertwined with capitalism, but that's a different video's topic. And so many people who left for Vietnam in the late 60s came back and saw an America transformed with a whole bunch of social justice issues making a lot of progress. And at the same time, they came home defeated, broken, traumatized, radicalized, and with a shit ton of military training under their belts. The stab in the back narrative is probably one you've heard before from, an older family member or from possibly even a history teacher. But before we get started, I have to say the whole narrative that soldiers had stuff thrown on them and that they were hated and disrespected and that the Vietnam War was winnable, but they just pulled out because they wanted to stay popular is all not true. It's not. It is an unfact. It is factant.
It's false. No way. Not this time.
And that this story is more propped up as an excuse for a lot of the behavior you're going to be seeing in the near future. And, of course, used very well by the right in American politics to justify further wars and a lot of the things to combat what was called Vietnam Syndrome, which will probably be maybe a topic for another video if you guys are interested. One of the people who came back from Vietnam was a man named Louis Beam, who historical research has already sort of uncovered that he was basically already leaning towards white nationalism and white supremacy before he left for Vietnam. But while he was in Vietnam, he radicalized in different directions. He became much more of a staunch anti-communist. His racist hatred expanded and intensified, focused on the Viet Cong and Vietnamese people in general. Through his diary and his writings, he had a lot of very traumatic, violent experiences, like many Vietnam veterans while he was there. And he came home traumatized, more racist than he was before, a staunch anti-communist, and as I mentioned earlier, fully trained up on paramilitary techniques, weapons, and all of the things associated with a guerrilla war. And as I mentioned in my previous video, for the few people who saw it, narratives can be very powerful in shaping how we conceive of the past, more so than the facts sometimes. I say sometimes, actually it's probably more common more so than the facts. And so a lot of soldiers coming home with this paramilitary training led to an increase in paramilitarism across the United States. And paramilitaries in America in this period in the late 70s were not confined to the right. There were left-wing paramilitaries. There was the Brown Berets, there was the Black Panthers. Black Panthers had existed before, but there were a lot of Vietnam veterans who came back to the Black Panthers and brought their paramilitary training with them. And this isn't the only time this has happened. Vietnam wasn't some sort of special war. One can just look to the history of the Ku Klux Klan. You can see that there's peaks in membership in the Klan and, resurgence in their violent activity after every major war that brought home a lot of white, angry veterans. The Klan itself was founded by Civil War veterans from the Confederacy, but you saw another spike in the 1920s, primarily driven by World War I veterans, and in the 1950s and 1960s, when it was primarily a violent terrorist group trying to combat the civil rights movement, it was also stocked with a whole bunch of World War II and Korean War veterans. And the, I guess we'll call Fourth Klan, or the allied with Nazis white power version of the Klan, coincides with veterans returning from the Vietnam War. Somebody who was part of this white power movement, but not necessarily the Klan, Timothy McVeigh, probably the most famous one, was a Gulf War veteran. And you know, coming home from a lost war with a narrative about the government stabbing you in the back, leading to a bunch of disaffected veterans who are really angry, leading to a far-right fascist movement, is also extremely similar to the story of what happened in Germany after World War I. So what happened? What happened in Vietnam that made people decide that they wanted to become parts of paramilitary groups and radicalize and all those kinds of things? The war experience for a lot of the veterans of Vietnam was very strange. They had very little actual interpersonal relationships with indigenous Vietnamese people. And when they did, it was usually with the Viet Cong. And the fight against the Viet Cong was not one based on territory acquisition. Instead, it was more focused on body counts. Killing more people was the more important goal, because really the land that was being fought over in Vietnam is not exactly the easiest land to hold or defend in any meaningful way. This lack of interpersonal contact meant that the Vietnamese people were not really seen as humans, that violent interactions and massacres were common in the Vietnam War. Most famously, the My Lai massacre, where Americans killed over 600 villagers who were not part of the Viet Cong at all. And on the note of the My Lai massacre, the way that the war was fought led to a blurring of the line between ally and enemy, or combatant or non-combatant, which meant that for people who, you know, in American culture it's fairly common to see things through a racialized lens, to see all people who look like a certain way as part of the enemy. And because the war was not fought over land, but was more a fight for casualties, that lends itself, like the tactics you learn and the lessons you learn fighting in a war like that, is better for building yourself into someone who would become a guerrilla or a paramilitary fighter after they come home. So Beam came home and was trying to find a place to put his racialized aggression to some sort of productive use. He tried joining the John Birch Society, which is a fanatically anti-communist group. He tried joining anti-integrationist citizen councils, tried joining anti-immigrant groups, and as he kept, moving further out, he'd get into more and more explicitly racist groups. He joined the Minutemen, who are a racist border patrol, and then eventually joining the American Nazi Party. And when the American Nazi Party wasn't working for him, he eventually also tried to join the States' Rights Party, which you can only picture what that group's about. The problem is that a lot of these groups were more criminal organizations or secret societies. They were focused on secrecy and not getting caught, and they weren't focused on actually attaining their goals through praxis, i.e. by shooting people. And so he was just finding himself more and more alienated from these groups as he went along. Most notably, he was concerned that communist forces were basically out for, white people. After the war, Louis Beam then bought 50 acres of Texas swampland. The terrain would not have been dissimilar from what he experienced when he was in Vietnam. And there, he built a paramilitary training camp. And his goal with this training camp was to turn it into a place to train a new splinter group of the Ku Klux Klan that was interested in fighting an actual war to fight not only communism, but to fight, all of the things that are hurting the interests of white people across the United States and the world. And using this Vietnam War story, the betrayal story, he started to inspire a string of these paramilitary camps, at least 3 in Texas. It was sort of a way to continue the fight against communism, but on the home front. And the group he made was as I mentioned, independent splinter of the Ku Klux Klan, specifically a group of the KKK that was set up by David Duke, which was called the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, otherwise known as the KKKK. And as these training camps started to go into operation, the main project that they decided to get involved with was border patrols, which is where a group of armed Klansmen would go to the borderlands, because it's in Texas, and basically try to kill or violently harass anybody who was trying to enter into the United States from Mexico illegally. But also by the late 70s, it was starting to become unpopular to be openly anti-black. So the Klan needed to rebrand, and their decision was to focus more on anti-communism and anti-immigrant stuff, hence the border patrols. And one of the projects that Louis Beam wanted to get involved with in order to raise the level of what they perceived as the coming race war was in this coastal town where a group of Vietnamese refugees, allies of America who left after the war was over because they were worried that there'd be, retaliation by the communist government, had moved to this coastal town and had started becoming shrimp fishers. Shrimp fishermen? Shrimpers? Shrimp trappers? They catch shrimp. Catching shrimp people. And there was some, norms and cultural differences between the white Texan shrimpers and the Vietnamese shrimpers. They did follow the law, or if they did break the law, they did not break the law in numbers that were different from the white shrimpers. They just outcompeted them in the free market because they worked longer hours and worked harder, and so they, caught more shrimp than the white shrimpers people. So instead of learning to get good, the white shrimpers decided to just aggravate a racist backlash against these Vietnamese refugees. And because this story was getting popular, the KKK started showing up and started threatening those Vietnamese people, including basically threatening to kill them if they didn't sell their boats and stop shrimping within 24 hours. Some had to move away from their community because they were literally targeting their houses and burning crosses, and it was just a real ugly situation. But luckily, the Southern Poverty Law Center stepped up to try and help the Vietnamese people by launching a court case against the Klan in which the Texas government had to enforce a law which basically said it was illegal to start paramilitary training camps in Texas. So Beam was forced to shut down his KKK paramilitary training camps. And essentially through this law, Texas just banned paramilitary's training in general. However, this case was very high profile, and racists and preppers and, strange libertarians across the country started setting up paramilitary camps in huge numbers in fear that this was basically the government trying to crack down on their Second Amendment right to learn how to become soldiers to harass people of color in their communities. And Beam himself would become a figurehead in the white power movement that was a new attempt to rebrand racist, white supremacist violence with more of a focus on organization and military training. And if you believe it, an even bigger emphasis on violence. But there was still a major problem in the racist white world in the late 1970s, which was that the Ku Klux Klan was one major faction. You know who they are. Neo-Confederates focused on particularly anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic activism and periodic acts of terrorism in order to intimidate people of color from doing things like living in communities or voting. The other major faction of, white heads in America was neo-Nazis. The American Nazi Party, National Socialist Party. There were Nazi groups all around America, and the two did not like each other, weirdly enough, mostly because the KKK, as I mentioned earlier in this video, was primarily made up of World War II veterans, or at least it had a lot of World War II veterans in its leadership. World War II veterans, not big fans of Nazis. And also, while the KKK was focused more on anti-black racism and anti-immigrant stuff, the Nazis were focused on anti-Semitic stuff, so their interests were not aligned at this point. Because what happened is that as white racists who fought in Vietnam came home, kind of like with Louis Beam, they became much more interested in anti-communism. And anti-communism is something that the Klan and Nazis can get behind. Mostly because if you study anti-communism, you'll find that it's extremely intertwined with white supremacy, to the point where I would argue that they're not necessarily different things. But there was an event that made these two groups really come together in a big way. And it happened in 1979 in the city of Greensboro. Greensboro is a city in North Carolina. And in the late 70s, it had this combination of having a large industrial workforce, lots of factories, lots of people working in factories, but very low unionization. And so a Maoist group called the Communist Workers' Party decided that they wanted to set themselves up there in order to try and create a communist movement, to have that leftist takeover of America by starting with a unionization drive in these places and sort of radicalizing and militarizing the unions. And on one fateful day in 1979, the Communist Workers' Party was having this Death to the Klan rally, basically an anti-racism, anti-Klan rally. They did not come armed, but many people who were there did have guns in their cars that they did not bring with them to the protest. The KKK and the neo-Nazis came together for this event, and they did not come unarmed. That's a double negative, so that means they were packing. And during this event, they did fire upon the leftists, injuring a whole lot of people, but killing 5 people. 4 white men and 1 black woman. In the end, 14 Klansmen and neo-Nazis were put on trial for murder, conspiracy, and rioting. And again, this was a really big, very publicized event. But because it was North Carolina, this was an all-white jury, and that meant that none of them were convicted. There was only partial justice that was brought about by a civil suit that happened afterwards. And because it was so high profile, this, first of all, brought a lot of people to be interested in white supremacists. And at the same time, it also showed that the state, the United States, was not going to prosecute heavily on them, that they were going to be allowed to get away with violence against people as long as it was against communists. And so a lot of these people thought that they had, some form of immunity, or at least some modicum of protection, at least as if they can be within extremely distended bounds of plausible deniability. And so a lot of these groups were starting to prepare for escalating violence and possible war. The logical conclusion of the narrative set up by the Vietnam experience that has sort of built into this unified white power movement. And on that note, we have to go into another area where these people were able to not only build a base of support, but make key allies, get important training and cash and weapons, which was the weird world of mercenaries and global paramilitary work. There's a whole mercenary network of people in America, and in the late 70s, this was really starting to take off because there was tons of Vietnam War veterans who came home and found that, doing purchasing for a grocery store was just not cutting it as a way of life. They had been too acclimated to a militarized lifestyle, that violence was too integrated into their self-concept to really enter main society again. And so a lot of Vietnam War veterans became mercenaries. Now I'm going to talk a whole lot about mercenaries here. What I want to say is that not all of these people are on paper card-carrying members of the neo-Nazis or the KKK. What I am going to say is that there's a really large overlap. The Venn diagram of mercenaries and this new sort of paramilitary trained white power movement in America is pretty huge. And they would go to a lot of the same conventions. And oftentimes when mercenary forces were sent to other countries, that there was a significant amount of, white power people in their, regiments. And that was actually quite helpful because a lot of the mercenary forces that fought in this sort of late 1970s, 1980s period, trying to prevent anti-colonial forces and preserve white minority rule, or they were part of right-wing military death squads trying to counter indigenous-led or socialist movements, basically trying to change the country to be more democratic, and sometimes they were a little socialist. So the United States was very much in the game of taking these countries that had elected like social democrats, and instead of letting them have like, stronger union power or having a better trade relationship with America, they instead would fund right-wing death squads and prop up some sort of like military junta. And one thing in the pre-internet days that sort of interconnected all of these groups was the magazine Soldier of Fortune, which is today sort of a big part of the tactical arsenal of like, your old uncle that has way too many guns might have. But Soldier of Fortune actually was a prominent magazine for mercenaries and people who are into guns and, like prepper types, and of course, this new cohort of white power people who are suddenly really into becoming a paramilitary and, getting ready for the big race war. And this magazine had conventions, they had meetups, and they also had, letters to the editor, and it had a whole thing that created a whole network that brought all of these different groups together. And many anti-democratic, pro-colonial movements during the Cold War would be filled with mercenaries who were part of the white power movement. And some of these people would become rather key figures in the history of these countries. For example, over 2,000 American mercenaries fought for the white supremacist minority rule government in Rhodesia. And a lot of them were members of the John Birch Society and neo-Nazi groups. But a lot of them were also just your standard rank and file mercenaries. But it didn't really matter. They all integrated, met with each other, and even the tail end of the fight in Rhodesia did have Vietnam veterans fighting as mercenaries to uphold white minority rule. And another Vietnam vet named Tom Posey started this mercenary group called Civilian Military Assistance that became really important in the history of Central America. I should also mention that Tom Posey had white supremacist connections of his own. But in the 1980s, CMA made shit tons of money as right-wing death squads trying to put down democratic and indigenous movements in Central America. And some of this was with support of the United States because they wanted to stop these democratic movements from happening because they were not loyal to America. And they were even socialists. Using mercenaries gave them a level of plausible deniability. If CMA has a group of their soldiers, massacre a bunch of indigenous people who were not combatants, the United States can just say, "Oh, the mercenaries, sorry, we don't know anything about them. Sorry, but my bad." And so they could even work with like U.S. support at the very least, or American money directly if they were. And so a lot of these mercenaries became right-wing death squads, joining with the right-wing death squads of the country. And they are responsible for many acts of horrific violence and large massacres. White power people could leave the United States and go into Central America, to join these movements as a way to give themselves the, supplies or, protection that they needed at the time. Oftentimes, they'd go into Central America to get cheap health care, or they would go to make money, trading weapons and drugs. Or sometimes they just go to avoid arrest in the United States. If you ever wonder who are the people that the CIA is like getting to, facilitate all of these, evil deeds they do, this is these mercenary type folks. And so in this gray zone of, mercenary work, the white power movement could get additional training. They could get battlefield experience. They could get money that they need. They could get supplies they need, because a lot of the weapons that these groups had are straight up illegal. The ATF always busts them and finds them with like illegal weapons for America. And they could also get access to healthcare, positions of power, and semi-legitimate work with the U.S. government. This alliance of different white power groups would blossom into the great variety of militia movements that we have today. And every time something brings in a bunch of people into the radical right, they lock arms with these groups and they have this large, distributed, non-centralized organization of essentially terrorist groups across the United States, ready for the big one. And I'm currently recording this while Donald Trump seems to be revving up to try and do a coup of the United States government. And knowing that those people are out there is Yeah. So it's important to know that these white supremacist groups that you hear of in the 1960s never disappeared. They merely changed form and have rebranded and readapted into the multitude of militias and hate groups and strange far-right preppers that you see today. Just know that they all have a lineage going back to a long history of America having violent, hateful white people trying to suppress people of color. And another lesson to take away from this is that war, even when it's abroad, always has a method of finding its way home. If you want to learn more about militias and white supremacists in America, I'm making a playlist. It's going to get longer in a few weeks, so keep eyes on it. And I'll see you guys all next time.